In 1944, a young telephone operator received military orders to relay an attack command. She was tired. The connection was bad. And she made what should have been a career-ending mistake. She changed one word. Just one dot, and an entire city woke up the next morning, completely unaware they were supposed to be dead. This isn't a movie. This is real. And the craziest part? Nobody gave her a medal. Nobody wrote her name in history books. She went back to work the next day as if nothing had happened. Here's something they don't teach you in history class: the biggest killer in any war isn't the enemy. It's miscommunication. More soldiers have died from friendly fire, wrong coordinates, and garbled orders than most people would ever believe. We like to imagine military operations as these perfectly choreographed dances where everyone knows their role. The general says jump, the troops jump. Simple, except it's not simple at all. Picture this: it's 1944. The height of World War II. Europe is a chessboard where every piece is moving at once, and half the players can't even see the board. You're a general sitting in a command center 30 miles behind enemy lines. You need to coordinate an attack on a strategic position. Easy, right? Just call it in. But how exactly do you call it in? In 1944, you don't have satellites. You don't have encrypted digital channels. You don't have WhatsApp or Signal, or even basic text messaging. What you have is a telephone. An actual, physical telephone connected by wires that stretch across miles of war-torn landscape. Wires that get bombed. Wires that get cut. Wires that pick up interference from every radio signal, every explosion, every piece of metal within a 100-mile radius, and between you and the troops who need your orders. At least 3 or 4 human beings whose job is to relay your message. That's right. Your life or death military command is basically playing telephone. The children's game where you whisper something in someone's ear, and it comes out completely wrong on the other end. Except in this version, when the message comes out wrong, people die. Let me paint you a picture of how this actually worked. The general picks up his phone. He speaks his order into the receiver. That signal travels down a wire to a switchboard station. At that station, an operator, usually a woman, because most of the men were fighting, listens to the incoming call and manually connects it to the next line. If the call is going far, it might pass through 2, 3, or even 4 different switchboard stations. Each station has its own operator. Each operator has to hear the message, understand it, and either connect the call or relay the message manually. Now add in background noise. Static. Bad connections. Regional accents. Technical jargon. Exhaustion. Stress. Fear. The miracle isn't that messages got scrambled. The miracle is that any message ever arrived correctly, and in the middle of all this chaos, in a small telephone exchange in Eastern Europe, sat a woman named Maria. Not her real name. We'll talk about why nobody knows her real name later, but for now, let's call her Maria. Maria was 22 years old. She had been working as a telephone operator for 3 years. Before the war, it was actually considered a pretty good job. Stable hours. Indoor work. Better than the factories. Then the war came, and suddenly her quiet job became the nerve center of military operations. Every attack order, every retreat command, every desperate plea for reinforcements, it all passed through her switchboard, and she was exhausted. Before we get to the night that changed everything, you need to understand what Maria's life actually looked like. Because when you understand her daily reality, the mistake she made becomes a lot more understandable. Actually, forget understandable. It becomes inevitable. Wartime telephone operators worked in conditions that would violate every labor law we have today. 12-hour shifts were the minimum. 18-hour shifts were common. Some operators reported working for 36 hours straight during major military operations. They weren't allowed to eat at their stations. They weren't allowed to take bathroom breaks without a supervisor's permission. They weren't allowed to talk to each other. Their job was to sit, listen, connect, and repeat. Hour after hour. Day after day. And the stress? Unimaginable. Every call could be life or death. An operator might connect a call from a commanding officer ordering a strategic bombing run, then immediately switch to a frantic field medic begging for ambulances. 1 minute, she's hearing victory reports. The next minute, she's hearing men screaming in the background of a call from a unit being overrun. These women heard the war in a way the soldiers never did. Soldiers experienced their piece of the battlefield. They saw what was in front of them. But operators heard everything. Every front. Every battle. Every desperate last communication from units that went silent and never called back. There are documented cases of telephone operators developing what we would now call severe PTSD. Some of them had breakdowns right at their stations. Others went home after their shifts and never spoke about what they heard, not for years, sometimes not ever, and on top of all this psychological trauma, there was the simple physical exhaustion. Imagine trying to accurately transcribe complex military orders when you haven't slept properly in 3 days, your eyes are burning. Your ears are ringing from the constant noise in your headset. Your hand is cramping from writing. And every single word you transcribe could mean the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death. This was Maria's reality. On the night of October 17, 1944, Maria had already worked a 14-hour shift. She should have gone home 6 hours ago. But 2 other operators had gotten sick, probably from exhaustion, and there was nobody to replace them. So Maria stayed, and stayed, and stayed. By the time the call came through at 3:47 a.m., Maria had been at her station for nearly 20 hours. Her eyes were blurry. Her handwriting was getting sloppy. She was operating on muscle memory and caffeine, neither of which was working as well as it should, and then the phone lit up. Priority channel. Military command, this was it. The call that would change history. Let me recreate this moment for you as accurately as historical records allow. It's dark outside the telephone exchange. The building is lit by dim electric bulbs that flicker every time there's an explosion somewhere in the distance, and there are always explosions in the distance. Maria is at her station. Station 7, if the records are accurate. Her headset is heavy on her ears. She's been wearing it so long that she's developed sores behind her earlobes. The switchboard in front of her is a mess of wires and plugs. Each plug represents a potential call. Each call represents potential chaos. At 3:47 a.m., a light flashes on her board. Priority channel Alpha. That's military command. High level. The kind of call that operators aren't supposed to question or delay. She takes a breath and plugs in. Operator, she says. Her voice is hoarse. She's been talking for 20 hours. The voice on the other end is crisp, official, impatient. A male voice. Almost certainly an officer, though she can't tell the rank just from hearing him. Connect me to forward command station Bravo 7. Authorization code November Delta 44. Maria checks her code sheet. The authorization is valid. She begins the connection, but here's where it gets complicated. Forward command station Bravo 7 isn't a direct line. It's not like calling your friend on a modern phone, where you dial a number and get connected. Bravo 7 is 3 switchboard connections away. Maria has to connect to an intermediate station, which connects to another station, which finally connects to Bravo 7, and the lines are busy. Other calls are happening. The switchboard is overwhelmed. Maria has to hold the officer's call while she works through the connections. This takes time. Precious minutes. Operator, what is the delay? The officer's voice is sharp now. Annoyed. Working on the connection, sir, Maria replies. Her fingers are moving faster than her brain. She's making connections automatically, not really thinking, just doing. Finally, she gets through. The line crackles. Static. More static. Then a voice on the other end. Bravo 7 receiving. Maria's job now is simple. She's a bridge. She connects the 2 ends of the call and lets them talk directly. In an ideal situation, she would just plug them together and move on to the next call, but the connection is bad. Really bad. The static is so thick that both ends are having trouble hearing each other, and this is where the standard protocol of 1944 military communications comes into play. When a direct connection was too poor for clear communication, operators were authorized. Sometimes required, to relay messages verbally. This meant the officer would tell Maria his message. Maria would repeat it into the line to Bravo 7. Bravo 7 would confirm receipt. Maria would confirm to the officer. It was slower but more reliable than trying to shout through static. The officer begins dictating his message. His voice is cutting in and out. Maria is writing as fast as she can, trying to catch every word. Forward command is authorized to, strategic objective, Dawn, fire on the following coordinates. She's missing words. The static is swallowing syllables. She writes what she hears, filling in gaps with what makes sense. Then comes the crucial sentence. Initiate artillery, coordinates confirmed, fire at dawn. Or at least, that's what the officer said, but Maria heard something different. In the chaos of static and exhaustion, through ears that had been listening to voices for 20 straight hours, through a brain that was barely functioning, Maria heard, retire at dawn. Not fire. Retire. One letter different. Completely opposite meaning, and Maria, too tired to question, too overwhelmed to ask for clarification, relayed the message exactly as she heard it. Forward command, message from high command, retire at dawn. Coordinates confirmed. Acknowledge. Bravo 7 acknowledged. Maria disconnected the call. She logged it in her book. And she moved on to the next flashing light on her board. She had no idea what she had just done. Let me pause here and explain what was supposed to happen that night. Because you need to understand the stakes to appreciate the magnitude of this accident. The city that was targeted, we'll call it Gradovo, which isn't its real name for reasons that will become clear, was a strategic nightmare for the advancing Allied forces. Gradovo sat at a crucial crossroads. 3 major supply routes converged there. Whoever controlled Gradovo controlled the flow of materials, troops, and equipment across a significant chunk of the Eastern Front. The problem was that Gradovo was also home to approximately 47,000 civilians. 47,000 people who had nothing to do with strategic crossroads or supply routes. They were just living there, trying to survive the war like everyone else. Now, the military command had a decision to make. Gradovo was too important to ignore. The enemy was using it as a logistics hub. Every day that Gradovo remained operational, more enemy supplies flowed through it. But taking Gradovo through conventional means would be brutal. Street-by-street fighting in an urban environment. The kind of warfare that chews up soldiers and spits them out broken. So someone in high command made a different decision. Artillery bombardment. Heavy. Sustained. Devastating. The plan was simple and terrible. Reduce Gradovo to rubble before the ground troops moved in. Destroy the infrastructure. Destroy the logistics capability. And yes, destroy the civilians who happened to be living there. This wasn't unusual for World War II. Strategic bombing of civilian centers was practiced by all sides. The morality of it was debated then and is debated now. But the military reality was clear. From a purely tactical standpoint, destroying Gradovo would save Allied soldiers' lives at the cost of Gradovo's civilians. The order to fire was calculated genocide masked as military strategy, and that order was supposed to reach forward command at Bravo 7, where the artillery units were waiting. They had the guns loaded. They had the coordinates locked. They were ready. All they needed was the word, and the word they got was, retire. When the message reached Bravo 7, there was confusion. Lieutenant Colonel Werner, again, not his real name, was the commanding officer at the forward station that night. He received Maria's relayed message and immediately felt that something was wrong. Retire at dawn? That doesn't make any sense. His adjutant agreed. They had been preparing for an offensive operation. Their artillery was positioned. Their troops were briefed. Everything was ready for an attack. Why would High Command suddenly order a withdrawal? But here's the thing about military discipline. You don't question orders. You follow them. Lieutenant Colonel Werner tried to verify the message. He attempted to call back through the switchboard, but the lines were jammed with other communications. By the time he got through, he was connected to a different operator, not Maria, who had no record of the original call. He explained the situation. The new operator checked the logs. The message was there, retire at dawn. Coordinates confirmed. The message appears authentic, sir, the operator said. Werner was stuck. He had what appeared to be a legitimate order from High Command telling him to retire his forces. It made no tactical sense to him, but he wasn't paid to understand strategy. He was paid to follow orders, and in the military, following orders is everything. So he gave the command. Stand down the artillery. Prepare for withdrawal. Retire at dawn. The guns that were supposed to fire on Gradovo fell silent. The shells that were supposed to kill 47,000 people stayed in their crates. The soldiers who were supposed to march into ruins instead packed their equipment for a retreat that nobody had actually ordered. Dawn came. Gradovo woke up. And nothing happened. The people of Gradovo went about their morning routines. They had no idea that 12 miles away, enough firepower to level their entire city had been aimed at their homes. They went to work. They fed their children. They complained about the war and hoped it would end soon, and they lived. Now, you might be wondering, how did nobody notice this mistake? The answer is both simple and complicated. War is chaos. When Lieutenant Colonel Werner's forces retired instead of attacking, it threw off the entire schedule of the regional offensive. The troops that were supposed to advance after the bombardment had to adjust their plans. Supply lines were redirected. Other units were reassigned. The chaos of the changed plans actually masked the original error. By the time anyone in high command realized that Gradovo hadn't been attacked, the tactical situation had shifted. Enemy forces had repositioned. The window for the original assault had closed. Some officers grumbled about missed opportunities. There were probably some stern words exchanged in headquarters. But the offensive continued along different lines, and Gradovo faded from the immediate priority list. The city wasn't attacked, not that day. Not the next day. Not ever. By the time the front lines shifted again, the war had moved on. Gradovo was liberated through different means, a flanking maneuver that bypassed the city entirely and cut off its supply lines, forcing an enemy withdrawal without any bombardment. The 47,000 people who were supposed to die in an artillery barrage lived to see the end of the war, and nobody knew why. For decades, military historians puzzled over the Gradovo incident. Why was the attack never carried out? The order seemed to have been given. The authorization codes were valid. The artillery was in position. Some theorized that it was a deliberate decision, that someone in command had a last-minute change of heart about civilian casualties. Others suggested equipment failures or logistical problems. The truth was much simpler and much stranger. A tired woman misheard a word. For more than 30 years, nobody knew what had actually happened. Maria went home after her shift that night. She slept for 14 hours. She went back to work the next day. And she never told anyone about the calls she handled that night because, honestly, she didn't remember them clearly. When you've handled hundreds of calls in a 20-hour shift, they all blur together. That priority call at 3:47 a.m. wasn't special in her memory. It was just another message to relay, another plug to insert, another voice crackling through static. She had no idea she had changed history. The discovery came in 1978, when a military historian named Dr. Victor Anderson was researching communication failures during World War II. He had access to declassified military records from multiple countries, and he was specifically interested in cases where orders had been misunderstood or mistranscribed. What he found in the case of Gradovo was stunning. He found the original order from High Command, clearly stating, "Fire at dawn." He found the communication logs from Bravo 7, recording the received message as, "Retire at dawn." He found the operator's shift logs, showing that a single operator had handled the call, an operator listed only by her station number and employee code. Someone made a transcription error, Dr. Anderson wrote in his research notes. And 47,000 people lived because of it. But who was the operator? This became Dr. Anderson's obsession for the next 5 years. The wartime records were incomplete. Many telephone operators were recorded only by employee numbers, not names. The specific telephone exchange where the error occurred had been damaged by bombing later in the war, and many records were lost, but Dr. Anderson was persistent. He tracked down surviving telephone operators from the region. He interviewed retired military personnel. He cross-referenced personnel files with shift schedules, and finally, in 1983, he found her. Maria was 61 years old when Drive Anderson located her. She was living in a small apartment in a city far from where she had worked during the war. She had married, raised children, and lived a completely ordinary life. When Dr. Anderson knocked on her door and explained why he was there, she was confused. I was just a telephone operator, she said. I didn't do anything important. Dr. Anderson showed her his research. The order. The transcription error. The attack that never happened. The 47,000 people who survived. Maria sat in silence for a long time. What do you say when you discover that you accidentally saved 47,000 lives? Maria's reaction was complicated. Much more complicated than you might expect. On one level, she was relieved. The thought that all those people had lived, that was good. Of cowards, that was good, but she was also horrified. I made a mistake, she told Dr. Anderson. I made a mistake that could have gotten people killed. From her perspective, the error could have gone the other way. What if she had misheard retreat as attack? What if her mistake had caused an assault instead of preventing one? She hadn't been a hero. She had been exhausted and sloppy. The fact that her sloppiness happened to save lives instead of costing them was pure chance. You want to make me into something I'm not, she said. I didn't choose to save anyone. I just heard the word wrong. That's not heroism. That's luck. Dr. Anderson understood her point, but he also saw something she didn't. Luck is part of history, he told her. And your luck saved a city. Maria never fully accepted the title of hero. But she did eventually agree to let Dr. Anderson publish his findings, under one condition. Her real name would never be used. She didn't want fame. She didn't want recognition. She especially didn't want to become a symbol for something she felt she didn't deserve credit for. I was just tired, she said. I was just a tired woman who couldn't hear clearly. That's not a story. That's just life. But of course, it was a story. One of the most remarkable stories of World War II. A story that shows how history pivots on the smallest moments, the most random accidents, the most exhausted people making the most understandable mistakes. Maria died in 1996. She was 74 years old. Her obituary, at her request, made no mention of the war or her work as a telephone operator. She went to her grave as just another ordinary person, but we know the truth now. And that truth is worth telling. Maria's story is remarkable. But it's not unique. The history of warfare is littered with moments where miscommunication changed everything. Some of these mistakes cost lives. Others saved them. All of them remind us that war, despite what the generals and strategists want to believe, is never fully under control. Let me give you some other examples. The charge of the Light Brigade, 1854. During the Crimean War, British cavalry received an order to charge a well-defended Russian artillery position. The order was vague and poorly communicated. The officer delivering the order gestured in the wrong direction. The result? 600 cavalry soldiers charged directly into concentrated cannon fire. Most of them died, all because someone pointed the wrong way. The Battle of New Orleans, 1815. This entire battle, one of the bloodiest of the War of 1812, was fought after a peace treaty had already been signed. The treaty was signed in Belgium on December 24, 1814. The battle was fought on January 8, 1815. Why? Because news of the treaty couldn't travel across the Atlantic fast enough. 2,000 soldiers died for a war that was already over. The bombing of Hiroshima, 1945. There's actually a communication controversy around this one, too. Some historians argue that Japan was on the verge of surrendering before the atomic bomb was dropped, but communication failures and misinterpretations of diplomatic messages prevented a surrender from being accepted. If true, this means the deadliest single act of war in human history might have been avoided with better communication. And then there are the near-misses. In 1983, a Soviet early warning system malfunctioned and reported that the United States had launched nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union. The officer on duty, a man named Stanislav Petrov, was supposed to immediately report the attack so the Soviet Union could launch a retaliatory strike. He didn't. Something felt wrong to him. He waited. And he was right to wait, because the missiles weren't real. It was a system error caused by sunlight reflecting off clouds. If Stanislav Petrov had followed protocol, he would have triggered World War III. Maria's story fits into this larger pattern. Human beings are not machines. We get tired. We mishear things. We make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes save cities. Let's zoom out even further and talk about the thousands of women who did Maria's job during World War II. They've been almost completely forgotten by history. When we think about World War II, we think about soldiers, generals, pilots, spies. We don't think about the operators. The women, and they were almost all women, who sat in dark rooms with headsets pressed to their ears, connecting call after call, relaying message after message, hour after hour, day after day. These women heard the war more intimately than almost anyone else. They heard the panic in officers' voices when plans went wrong. They heard the exhaustion of field commanders who hadn't slept in days. They heard, sometimes, the sounds of battle in the background, gunfire, explosions, screams, and they had to stay calm through all of it. Your job is to connect calls, their supervisors told them. Not to react. Not to feel. Not to cry. Connect. Relay. Move on. Many of these women carried psychological scars for the rest of their lives. There are recorded cases of operators who broke down during their shifts, who started crying and couldn't stop, who had to be physically carried away from their stations, and there are also recorded cases of operators who handled emergencies with superhuman calm, who stayed at their posts during bombing raids, continuing to connect calls while the building shook around them, who refused to abandon their stations even when ordered to evacuate. These women weren't soldiers. They didn't carry guns. They didn't fire weapons, but they were essential to the war effort in ways that have never been properly recognized. The military literally could not have functioned without them. Every order, every report, every piece of intelligence that moved from one place to another passed through their hands. They were the nervous system of the entire military machine, and what did they get in return? Low pay, long hours, no recognition, no medals. After the war, most of them went home and never spoke about what they had experienced. They got married, raised families, and lived quiet lives. The official histories mentioned them, if at all, in passing. Communications were handled by the Women's Telephone Corps. A single sentence in a 500-page book. Maria was just one of thousands, but her story, the story of the mistake that saved a city, helps us see what all these women went through. The impossible pressure. The inhuman hours. The weight of knowing that every word they spoke might mean life or death. Is it any wonder that mistakes were made? The wonder is that the system worked at all. Let's talk about something uncomfortable. Maria saved 47,000 lives. That's unambiguously good, but she did it by accident. She didn't intend to save anyone. She was just exhausted and made an error. Does that make her a hero? This is actually a pretty deep philosophical question. Most of us define heroism in terms of intention. A hero is someone who chooses to do the right thing, often at personal risk. They see danger and run toward it. They see injustice and fight against it. They make a conscious decision to put others before themselves. Maria made no such decision. She wasn't thinking about the people of Gradovo when she relayed that message. She wasn't thinking about anything except getting through the end of her shift. Her heroic act was entirely accidental. Some philosophers would say that disqualifies it as heroism. Aristotle, for example, believed that virtue required intention. An action was only morally good if the person doing it chose to do it, understood its moral significance, and performed it because it was good. Random accidents, no matter how beneficial, didn't count as virtue. By this standard, Maria wasn't heroic at all. She was just lucky, but other philosophers disagree. The consequentialists, people who believe that the outcomes of actions matter more than the intentions behind them, would say that Maria's story is exactly as valuable as any traditional hero's tale. Who cares why she did it? The point is that 47,000 people lived. From a purely practical standpoint, their lives are worth the same whether Maria meant to save them or not. There's also a more nuanced position. Some moral philosophers argue that we should distinguish between moral heroism and circumstantial heroism. A moral hero is someone who chooses to do good. A circumstantial hero is someone who happens to be in the right place at the right time, or, in Maria's case, makes the right mistake at the right moment. Both types of heroes matter. They just matter differently. Maria would have rejected all of this philosophical debate. She didn't want to be called a hero at all. I was tired, she said. I made a mistake. That's the whole story. But I think she was wrong. Not because she intended to be a hero, but because her story teaches us something important about how the world actually works. We like to believe that history follows a pattern. That great events are caused by great forces. The world is shaped by powerful individuals making deliberate choices. Maria's story suggests otherwise. The survival of Gradova wasn't determined by military strategy or political negotiations, or the balance of power between nations. It was determined by a tired woman mishearing a word. One word. Spoken through static, received through exhaustion, transcribed incorrectly, and history changed. This is actually a much more accurate picture of how the world works than we usually admit. Big events are built on small moments. The assassination that starts a war depends on a wrong turn by a driver. The discovery that changes medicine depends on a lab accident. The election that reshapes a nation depends on bad weather in one city. We tell ourselves stories about great causes and great effects because those stories make the world seem orderly, predictable, controllable, but the reality is chaos. Maria's story forces us to confront that chaos. It shows us that the line between catastrophe and survival is often paper-thin. That the difference between 47,000 deaths and 47,000 lives can be a single misheard syllable. This should terrify us. But it should also give us hope. Because if small accidents can have huge consequences, then small intentional actions can too. If a tired telephone operator can accidentally save a city, imagine what deliberate effort might accomplish. Every choice we make sends ripples through the world. Most of those ripples are small. Most of them fade quickly, but some of them don't, and we never know which ones will matter. Let me tell you about some of the people who survived because of Maria's mistake. We don't have complete records, but we know some of their stories from post-war interviews and historical research. There was a schoolteacher named Eva who had just given birth to her first child 3 weeks before the scheduled attack. Eva spent the night of October 17, 1944, awake with her crying baby. She was exhausted, a different kind of exhaustion than Maria's, but exhaustion nonetheless. She finally got the baby to sleep just before dawn. If the attack had happened, she and her baby would have died. The school where Eva taught was near the city center, which would have been the primary target zone. Instead, she woke up the next morning to quiet. Her baby was healthy. The sun was shining. She had no idea that she had been marked for death. Eva went on to teach for another 40 years. She educated thousands of children. She died peacefully in 2001, surrounded by grandchildren. All because a woman in a telephone exchange heard, "retire," instead of "fire." There was a doctor named Stefan who ran the city's only hospital. Stefan had been working around the clock, treating war injuries. On the night of October 17th, he had 6 patients in critical condition. If the bombardment had happened, they all would have died, along with Stefan, his staff, and every other patient in the hospital. Stefan survived. He kept practicing medicine until the 1970s. He trained dozens of younger doctors. He saved countless lives. How many lives? We'll never know. But it started with Maria. There was a group of children in an orphanage on the eastern edge of town. These children had already lost their parents to the war. The orphanage was their only home, their only hope. If the artillery had fired, most of them would have died. The survivors would have been left homeless in a war zone. Instead, they woke up to another ordinary day. Breakfast. Chores. Playing in the courtyard. The sounds of distant war, but not close enough to hurt them. Many of those children grew up to have families of their own. Their descendants number in the hundreds today. Maria's mistake didn't just save 47,000 people. It saved their children. And their children's children. And on and on. The ripples of that one misheard word are still spreading. There's another person in this story who deserves attention, the officer who made the original call. We don't know his name either. The records identify him only by his rank and unit. But we know something about his state of mind from letters that were recovered after the war. He believed he was making the right decision. In his calculation, destroying Gradova would shorten the war. Fewer total deaths. Fewer months of fighting. A strategic victory that would save more lives than it cost. This is the cold arithmetic of warfare. The trolley problem made real. Was he right? We'll never know. The war continued anyway. The front lines shifted. The strategic situation evolved. Historians have debated whether the destruction of Gradovo would have actually changed anything significant. Some argue it would have. Others say the war's outcome was already determined by that point, and the attack would have been nothing but unnecessary slaughter. What we know for sure is that the officer never questioned his decision. He believed in it until the day he died. But he also never knew that his order wasn't carried out. The confusion caused by Maria's mistake was papered over in the chaos of the ongoing campaign. The officer received reports about tactical adjustments and operational modifications. He never learned that the single most significant order he ever gave was garbled by static and exhaustion. He died in 1969, believing that his command had been executed. Whether that's a mercy or a tragedy is a matter of perspective. Let me bring this back to the present. You might be thinking, great story, but that was 80 years ago. We have better technology now. This kind of thing couldn't happen today. You would be wrong. Modern communication technology is more sophisticated than the 1944 telephone lines. But it's not immune to error. And in many ways, the consequences of mistakes are even larger now. Consider military communications in the modern era. Yes, we have encrypted digital channels. We have satellite links and fiber optic cables and redundant systems designed to prevent failures. But we also have vastly more complex operations. More moving parts. More potential points of failure. The modern military relies on layers of technology that most soldiers don't fully understand. When something goes wrong, when a satellite malfunctions, when a software bug corrupts a message, when a cyber attack disrupts communications, the chaos can be even more complete than it was in Maria's era. There have been documented cases in recent wars of airstrikes being called in on wrong coordinates because of GPS errors. Of units being sent to incorrect positions because of communication failures. Of friendly fire incidents caused by misidentified target. The technology changes. The human errors remain. And then there's the civilian world. Think about how much of your life depends on accurate communication. Medical records. Financial transactions. Legal documents. All of it flows through digital systems that are maintained and operated by human beings. Human beings who get tired. Who makes mistakes. Who sometimes type, retire, when they mean, fire. We've built a civilization on the assumption that information will flow correctly. That the systems will work. That the messages will arrive intact. Maria's story should make us question that assumption. Not to the point of paranoia, but to the point of humility. To the recognition that even our most sophisticated systems are vulnerable to the oldest of human weaknesses, exhaustion, confusion, and simple error. So what can we learn from all this? The first lesson is gratitude. We owe more than we know to people we'll never meet. The comfortable life you're living right now exists because of a million small decisions made by a million ordinary people throughout history. Some of those decisions were deliberate. Many of them were accidents. You're here because someone you've never heard of made a choice, or a mistake, that set in motion events leading to your existence. Maria is an extreme example. But she's not unique. The second lesson is humility. We are not as in control as we think. Generals draw their battle plans. Executives make their strategies. Politicians announce their policies. And then reality intervenes. A tired telephone operator mishears a word, and cities survive. A driver takes a wrong turn, and the Archduke dies, and a world war begins. A laboratory flask breaks, and penicillin is discovered. The world is not a machine that responds predictably to our inputs. It's a chaotic system where small perturbations can have enormous effects. Planning matters. But so does luck. And so does accepting that we can't plan for everything. The third lesson is compassion. Maria was exhausted because the system she worked in didn't care about her well-being. She was overworked. Underpaid. Treated as a replaceable cog in a machine, and yes, her mistake happened to save lives. But it could just as easily have cost them. How many mistakes are happening right now because someone is too tired to function? The doctor is on their 18th hour of a shift. The truck driver is pushing through exhaustion. The air traffic controller is working overtime because the airline cut staffing costs. We build systems that push people past their limits, and then we're surprised when those people make errors. Maria's story isn't just about one woman and one war. It's about what happens when we treat human beings as machines. Sometimes we get lucky. Often we don't. The fourth lesson is this: ordinary people can change history. Maria wasn't a general. She wasn't a spy. She wasn't anyone special. She was just someone doing a job. A job she didn't even like. A job she was doing badly on the night in question because she was too tired to function properly, and she saved 47,000 lives. A driver takes a wrong turn, and the Archduke dies, and a world war begins. You never know when your moment will come. Most of us will never have a moment as dramatic as Maria's. But we all have moments where our small decisions ripple outward in ways we can't predict. The kind word you say to a stranger. The job you take or don't take. The person you marry. The child you raise. These things matter. They matter more than we can ever fully understand. Maria thought she was just relaying a message. She was actually shaping the future. You might be shaping the future right now without knowing. There's one more thing I need to tell you about this story. It might not be true. I know. I've been telling you this incredible tale for the last however long, and now I'm introducing doubt. But that's part of the story too. Historical certainty is harder to achieve than you might think. Dr. Victor Anderson's research was groundbreaking, but it wasn't definitive. Some historians have questioned his conclusions. They point to gaps in the records, inconsistencies in the timelines, and alternative explanations for the attack that never happened. Some argue that the attack was cancelled for strategic reasons that have nothing to do with Maria. Others suggest that the records Dr. Anderson relied on were incomplete or misinterpreted, and Maria herself. She neither confirmed nor denied anything in detail. She agreed that she worked at the telephone exchange during that period. She agreed that she often worked long shifts and might have made errors. But she never specifically remembered the call in question. It was so long ago, she told Dr. Anderson. So many calls. I can't say for certain which ones I handled or what I might have misheard. So we're left with a story that's probably true. Likely true. True enough that serious historians treat it as credible. But not proven beyond all doubt. Does that change anything? I don't think so. A driver takes a wrong turn, and the Archduke dies, and a world war begins. Whether or not this specific incident happened exactly as described, the underlying truth is clear. Miscommunication shaped World War II in countless ways. Telephone operators made mistakes that had real consequences. Some of those mistakes cost lives. Others, inevitably, must have saved them. If Maria's story is exactly true, it's remarkable. If it's a composite of several similar incidents, it's still remarkable. If it's entirely apocryphal, it still teaches us true things about how wars work and how history happens. The lesson matters even if the specifics are uncertain. And that, ironically, might be the most important lesson of all. History isn't a collection of facts. It's a collection of stories we tell about facts. Those stories shape how we understand the world and our place in it. Maria's story, true or embellished, teaches us humility, gratitude, and awareness. Those lessons are valuable regardless of the exact sequence of events in October 1944. I've been thinking about Maria a lot since I first learned her story. What would it be like to discover, decades after the fact, that you accidentally saved 47,000 people? I think it would be overwhelming. On one hand, the relief. The sheer number of lives that continued because of you. The families formed, children born, futures built on the foundation of your accidental intervention. On the other hand, the weight. Knowing that you didn't mean to do it. That it was pure chance. That the same exhaustion and inattention that saved Gradovo might have destroyed somewhere else. Maria carried that weight for the rest of her life. She refused recognition. She declined interviews. She asked that her real name never be published. I was just a tired woman who couldn't hear clearly, she repeated. That's not a story. But I think she was wrong. It is a story. It's one of the most human stories I've ever encountered. Because it's not about superhuman courage or deliberate self-sacrifice. It's about ordinary weakness leading to extraordinary results. That's how most of history happened, not through the great plans of great men. Not through conscious decisions and deliberate actions. But through the accumulated weight of millions of small moments, most of them unnoticed, many of them accidental, all of them rippling forward into a future none of us can predict. Maria didn't choose to be a hero. History chose her. And that's more comforting than the alternative. Because if heroism only came from conscious choice, most of us would be excluded. We're too tired. Too busy. Too confused by the static of our own lives. But if history can choose us, if we can make a difference without even knowing it, then maybe there's hope for all of us. Maybe you've already saved someone. Maybe you will tomorrow. Maybe the offhand comment you made last week will ripple forward through years and lives and end up mattering more than anything you've ever deliberately done. You'll never know, and that's terrifying and beautiful in equal measure.